The Republic of Austria has a free and public school system, and 9 years of education are mandatory. Schools offer a series of vocational, technical and university preparatory tracks involving 1 to 4 additional years of education beyond the minimum mandatory level. The legal basis for primary and secondary education in Austria is the School Act of 1962. The Federal Ministry of Education is responsible for funding and supervising primary, secondary, and, since 2000, also tertiary education. Primary and secondary education is administered on the state level by the authorities of the respective states. Federal legislation played a prominent role in the education system, and laws dealing with education effectively have a de facto constitutional status because, like Austrian constitutional law, they can only be passed or amended by a two-thirds majority in parliament. General education. Pupils in Austria are required to complete 4 years of elementary school. After this, gifted students have the option to visit higher learning institutions that prepare one for university, whereas the majority go on to vocational preparatory schools. Some vocational, general schooling institutions end after a total of 8 years of schooling, whereas the higher institution, gymnasium, finishes after a total of 12 years. These students receive the Matura, the university admissions certificate, after the final exams. Some pupils decide to attend trade schools after their general schooling, which can also end with the Matura, although these only offer admission into specific areas of study at tertiary level. Private schools. Private schools that provide primary and secondary education and some teacher training are run mainly, but by no means exclusively, by the Roman Catholic Church and account for approximately 10% of the 6,800 schools and 120,000 teachers. Roman Catholic schools have a reputation for more discipline and rigor than public institutions, and some are considered elite institutions. Because there is no tradition of private university education in Austria, the state has a virtual monopoly on higher education. This has been changing slowly in recent years as private universities become more commonplace. History. Before 1774, education in Austria was a task of the church. Convent schools were therefore the only educational establishments, and school fees were charged. This is why only the ones who could afford to pay these fees were educated, whereas poorer people remained illiterate. Mandatory primary education was introduced by Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, mandating in 1775 that all children of both sexes from the ages of 6 to 12 had to attend school. Furthermore, textbooks were unified and teacher education was regulated. Even though schooling became compulsory for both girls and boys for a time period of 6 years, girls were not allowed to attend professional or secondary schools. The first secondary school for girls was opened in 1868. The first gymnasium for girls was founded in 1892. From 1872, girls were also allowed to graduate, yet remained excluded from universities. From 1901, young women who had graduated were allowed to attend certain universities, with restrictions considering the fields of study. In 1910, girls were admitted to boys' gymnasiums, but they were neither allowed to participate actively in class, nor to take part in exams. The history of the Austrian education system since World War II may be characterized as an attempt to transform higher education from a traditional entitlement of the upper social classes to an equal opportunity for all social classes. Before the School Act of 1962, Austria had a two-track education system. After 4 years of compulsory primary education from the ages of 6 to 10 in the elementary school, or Volksschule, children and their parents had to choose between the compulsory secondary level for 11 to 14-year-olds called the middle school, or Hauptschule, or the first 4 years of an 8-year university preparatory track at higher schools of general education. Before the 1962 reform, the great majority of children, more than 90%, attended the compulsory Hauptschule, where they were divided according to their performance in elementary school into two groups. A group, which was directed toward 2 to 4 year vocational technical training schools after graduation from the Hauptschule, and B group, which was required to complete one additional year of compulsory education before entrance into apprenticeship programs or the workforce. The remaining elementary school graduates, less than 10%, enrolled in the Rs at age 11. Children attending these university track schools also had to choose a specific course of study. The rigidity of the two-track system required that the most important educational decision in a child's life, with all of the implications it had for the future, be made at the age of 10. The decision depended to a great extent on the parents' background, income, and social status. Children from agricultural backgrounds or of urban working-class parents generally attended the Volksschule and the Hauptschule and then entered the workforce. Children having lower middle-class backgrounds frequently received vocational technical training after the Hauptschule, while children from the upper middle and upper classes, boys in particular, attended the Rs, which gave them access to university-level education. The early selection process meant that children of the largest segment of the population, farmers and workers, were grossly underrepresented at higher schools and universities, whereas the children of a relatively small segment of the population, those who had attended higher schools or the universities, were overrepresented. Consequently, the education system tended to reproduce or to reinforce traditional social structures instead of being a vehicle of opportunity or social mobility. The Act of 1962 and subsequent amendments required that all state-funded schools be open to children regardless of birth, gender, race, status, class, language, or religion. The law also attempts to introduce more flexibility into the traditional two-track system and to provide students with a greater degree of latitude within it so that educational decisions can be made at an older age. Although the primary and secondary school system continues to be fundamentally based on the two-track idea, after a series of reforms in the 1970s and 1980s, 10 to 14-year-olds are no longer streamed into A and B groups in the Hauptschule. Graduates of this kind of school also have the opportunity to cross over into certain branches of the Rs track at the age of 14 or to attend a series of different, higher vocational technical schools, which have 5-year programs of specialization in various branches of technology and in business and commerce. Other than the less prestigious 3-year Berufsbildende Mittelschulen, those schools allow graduates to move on to university. Shifts in enrollment patterns reflect these changes in the school system. In the mid-1960s, less than 10% of all students finished the university preparatory Rs track, and more than 66% of them were male. By the early 1990s, more than 30% of all students finished the Rs track and just above 50% of them were female. Furthermore, a second educational path was developed that permitted some students without a diploma from the university track Rs to enroll in a university. As a general rule, the quality of Hauptschule education is high, especially in rural areas and small communities, where the schools have maintained their traditional social importance and where attendance at an Rs involves commuting considerable distances, or, for the inhabitants of more remote areas, boarding. In urban centers with a full spectrum of educational opportunities, the Hauptschule has become less popular, and parents who would not necessarily have enrolled their children in an Rs a few years ago have begun doing so. The increased enrollments have overburdened the Rs and created a shortage of students at the Hauptschulen and at vocational technical schools. In some areas, this trend has been strengthened by the number of children of foreign workers in the compulsory schools. In 1991, for example, almost 30% of all school-aged children in Vienna were children of foreign-born workers, whose mother tongue was not German. In some districts of the city, these children exceeded 70%. Although the children of long-term foreign workers frequently speak German well, the numbers of classes in which students with inadequate mastery of German are overrepresented has overburdened the Hauptschule system and made it a less desirable alternative than it used to in the past. Therefore, special remedial and intercultural programs are being developed so that the compulsory school system in Austria can continue to fulfill its educational and social roles. The SPÖ has continued to press for further reforms of the school system. It argued for an abolition of the two-track system for 10 to 14-year-olds and for combining the Hauptschule and the first 4 years of the Rs into a new comprehensive middle school. As of 2007 update, however, this alternative has been limited to a number of experimental schools. Other political parties, the Austrian People's Party in particular, remain firmly in favor of the current system, claiming that a comprehensive middle school could not accommodate for different levels of capability and giftedness. They fear a general dumbing down of secondary education as a result. Owing to the particular nature of Austria's educational laws, a multi-party agreement is needed to change the status quo. Matura. The official term for Matura in Austria is Reifeprüfung. The document received after the successful completion of the written and oral exams is called Maturationis. In the gymnasium, which, as opposed to vocational schools, focuses on general education, the Matura consists of 3 to 4 written exams to be taken on consecutive mornings and 3 to 4 oral exams to be taken on the same half-day about a month later. All examinations are held at the school which the candidate last attended. Candidates have to write a scholarly paper to be submitted at the beginning of February. This paper also needs to be defended in an oral exam. Vocational schools with a focus on either business and economics or technical subjects, such as commercial academies and polytechnics, also finish with the Matura, but last 5 years as opposed to the 4-year Oberstufe of the gymnasium. In vocational schools, an Ausbildungsschwerpunkt is chosen by all students, which then constitutes the main focus of their schooling, and is a compulsory subject at the Matura examinations. The grading system is the one universally used in Austrian schools. 1 is excellent, 2 is good, 3 is satisfactory, 4 is sufficient, and 5 means that you have failed. In addition, a candidate's Maturationis contains a formalized overall assessment. Mit ausgezeichnetem Erfolgbestanden, mit gutem Erfolgbestanden, and nicht bestanden. Candidates who have failed may retake their exams in September, October or February, March of the following school year. Compulsory subjects for the written finals are German and mathematics, as well as a living language teachers. Formally, however, there is an examination board, consisting of a candidate's teachers, examiners, the headmaster, headmistress and a Vorsitzender, usually a high-ranking school official or the head of another school. All oral exams are public, but attendance by anyone other than a candidate's former schoolmates is not encouraged, and indeed rare. It is, of course, possible for Austrians of all age groups to take the Matura. Adults from their 20s on are usually tutored at private institutions of adult education before taking their final tests, held separately before a regional examination board. Criticism of the Austrian Matura has been persistent. In particular, it has been argued that the current system encourages rote learning, hinders candidates' creativity and obscures the fact that the body of knowledge is constantly changing. Various forms of alternative assessment have been proposed, most notably the portfolio as well as teamwork and peer review, also in exam situations. In fiction, Friedrich Thorberg's novel Der Schülergerber about a Matura candidate driven to suicide on the day of his oral exams by his cruel mathematics teacher has become a classic. Education technology and Austrian education. Austrian education system define education technology as the use of technology to improve education. It is a systematic, iterative process for designing instruction or training used to improve performance. Other definition. Pupils in Austria are required to complete 4 years of elementary school. After this, gifted students have the option to visit higher learning institutions that prepare one for university, whereas the majority go on to vocational preparatory schools. Some vocational, general schooling institutions end after a total of 8 years of schooling, whereas the higher institution, gymnasium, finishes after a total of 12 years. These students receive the Matura, the university admissions certificate, after the final exams. Some pupils decide to attend trade schools after their general schooling, which can also end with the Matura, although these only offer admission into specific areas of study at tertiary level. Private schools. Private schools that provide primary and secondary education and some teacher training are run mainly, but by no means exclusively, by the Roman Catholic Church and account for approximately 10%. The Republic of Austria has a free and public school system, and 9 years of education are mandatory. Schools offer a series of vocational, technical and university preparatory tracks involving 1 to 4 additional years of education beyond the minimum mandatory level. The legal basis for primary and secondary education in Austria is the School Act of 1962. The Federal Ministry of Education is responsible for funding and supervising primary, second of the 6,800 schools and 120,000 teachers. Roman Catholic schools have a reputation for more discipline and rigor than public institutions, and some are considered elite institutions. Because there is no tradition of private university education in Austria, the state has a virtual monopoly on higher education. This has been changing slowly in recent years as private universities become more commonplace. History. Before 1774, and, since 2000, also tertiary education. Primary and secondary education is administered on the state level by the authorities of the respective states. Federal legislation played a prominent role in the education system, and laws dealing with education effectively have a de facto constitutional status because, like Austrian constitutional law, they can only be passed or amended by a 2/3 majority in parliament. General education.